The cage rattled violently as we dropped, a metal box suspended by a fraying cable plunging into the throat of the earth. I've been a coal miner in West Virginia for 20 years. I know the rhythm of the dark. I know the smell of sulfur, the taste of coal dust that coats your tongue like black sugar, and the feeling of the mountain pressing down on your skull like a vice. But tonight felt different. My name is Frank, and I was the shift lead for a skeleton crew sent to open up a new seam in Sector 4. The air in the elevator felt heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up and sparked small shocks against the metal mesh. Beside me stood Vance, our foreman. He was a greedy man with soft hands who rarely came down this deep, sweating through his clean jumpsuit. Next to him were Russo and O'Malley, two younger guys who were tough as nails but looked nervous tonight, eyes darting at the flickering bulb overhead. We were dropping past the 2,000-foot mark, deeper than the company usually allowed. The lights on our helmets were the only thing pushing back the crushing blackness. I looked at the depth gauge. The needle was vibrating wildly. We were descending into the oldest part of the mountain, a place the old-timers called the Boneyard. They said the earth down here didn't want to be disturbed. I didn't believe in ghosts, but as the temperature dropped and the air grew stale, I tightened my grip on my pickaxe until my knuckles turned white. The mountain was holding its breath, waiting for us. The cage hit the bottom with a bone-jarring thud that rattled our teeth. The metal gate slid open with a screech that echoed like a scream in the vast, empty tunnel. We stepped out into Sector 4. It was silent. Usually a mine hums with the sound of ventilation fans and distant drills, but down here, the silence was absolute. It was a dead zone, devoid of life. Our boots crunched loudly on the loose shale as we walked toward the face of the coal seam, the sound swallowed by the gloom. "All right, boys," Vance said, his voice sounding too loud and jittery in the confined space. "Headquarters says the seismic scans picked up a massive pocket of anthracite just behind this wall. We blast it, we load it, we get rich. Simple." I looked at the wall of rock in front of us. It didn't look right. The strata lines were twisted, contorted as if the rock had been melted and cooled rapidly. "I don't like it, Vance," I said, running a gloved hand over the cold stone. It felt unnaturally slick. "The rock is too dense, and look at the moisture. It's bleeding." Water was weeping from the cracks in the coal, but it wasn't clear. It was dark and viscous, smelling faintly of iron and copper. "Just set the charges, Frank," Vance snapped, checking his expensive watch. "We're on a schedule. The company pays for coal, not superstition." I sighed, feeling a pit form in my stomach, and signaled Russo to bring up the explosives. We drilled the holes, inserted the dynamite, and ran the wire back to the blast shield, the silence pressing against our ears. We huddled behind the thick steel blast shield, 50 yards back from the face. I held the detonator, my thumb hovering over the button. The air tasted of ozone and anxiety. "Fire in the hole!" I yelled, the warning ritual giving me a small sense of comfort in the oppressive dark. I pressed the button. Boom! The explosion rocked the tunnel violently. Dust billowed out in a choking gray cloud, instantly blinding us. The shockwave hit our chests like a physical punch, knocking the wind out of O'Malley. We waited for the ventilation to clear the air, coughing into our masks, our eyes watering from the grit. As the dust settled, our helmet lights cut through the haze like lighthouses in a fog. We walked back toward the blast zone to inspect the damage, boots sliding on debris. We expected to see a pile of shattered coal. We expected to see the glimmer of a new vein. We didn't see either. The blast hadn't just cracked the rock, it had punched a hole right through it. We were staring into a gaping, jagged maw of darkness. It wasn't a natural cavern. The edges of the hole were smooth, almost polished, like glass. A rush of cold, stale air blew out from the opening, carrying a scent that made my stomach turn instantly. It smelled like wet fur, old rotting meat, and something acidic. "What is that?" O'Malley whispered, shining his light into the void. "That ain't a coal pocket. That goes on forever. We stood at the edge of the breach, staring into the unknown. The tunnel continued on the other side, widening out into a massive chamber that our lights couldn't fully illuminate. The darkness seemed thicker there, resistant to our beams. It looked like an old mine shaft, Russo suggested, his voice trembling as he peered over my shoulder. Maybe from the 1800s? Some bootleg operation? No, I said, shaking my head. There are no records of mines this deep. And look at the floor. I pointed my light downward. The floor of the chamber beyond wasn't rough stone or rail ties. It was smooth, packed dirt, worn down by centuries of traffic. Something had been walking down here for a long time, patting the earth down into a road. Then we heard it. It started low, barely audible over the ringing in our ears from the blast. A sound coming from deep inside the darkness. Whee! It was a whistle, a high-pitched, mimicking whistle. It sounded almost human, but the cadence was wrong. It was too long, too breathless, lacking the intake of air a human needs. "Is there someone down there?" Vance called out, stepping closer to the edge, his greed momentarily paused. "Hello, use your radio!" The whistle answered immediately, louder this time. It mimicked Vance's tone perfectly, mocking him. It wasn't a distress signal. It sounded like a dinner bell ringing for the starving. "We need to leave," I said, backing away from the hole, my instinct screaming at me to run. "We seal this up and call safety inspection. That isn't a miner. That's something else." Vance grabbed my arm, his grip painful and desperate. "Are you insane? Look at the walls in there, Frank." He pointed his high-powered flashlight into the chamber. The walls glittered. It wasn't just coal. There were veins of something metallic, shimmering gold and silver in the light. "That's rare earth mineral," Vance said, greed lighting up his eyes like a Christmas tree, overriding his fear. "We are going in. We stake the claim now." "Vance, that whistle," I tried to argue, pulling my arm back. "It's just wind, Frank. Wind blowing through the cracks." He pushed past me and stepped through the breach into the unknown chamber. "You boys want a bonus or not? Get the gear. We're mapping this." Russo and O'Malley looked at me. They were scared, shaking in their boots, but they needed the money. They followed the boss like sheep to the slaughter. I cursed under my breath, checked the safety on my flare gun, and followed them into the dark. I couldn't leave them alone. That whistle hadn't sounded like wind. It sounded like a hunter calling to its pack. The chamber was massive, the ceiling disappearing into shadows 50 feet above us. The air here was freezing, far colder than the mine shaft we had just left. As we walked deeper, the light from the breach faded behind us, swallowed by the gloom. We were entirely reliant on our helmet lamps, tiny specks of light in a cathedral of night. I looked over at the wall to inspect the minerals Vance was so excited about. Up close, I realized something terrifying. The walls weren't smooth because of water erosion or tools. I ran my gloved hand over the stone. There were grooves, thousands of them. They were claw marks. Something with claws as hard as diamond dug this entire tunnel system by hand. The shimmering veins weren't minerals. They were polished streaks where the claws had fused the silica in the rock by sheer friction and heat. "Vance," I hissed, my throat dry as sandpaper. "Look at the walls. These are scratches. This is a burrow." "So what?" Vance muttered, distracted by his scanner. "Maybe underground water pressure." "Water doesn't leave 4 parallel gouges," I said, tracing the lines. "Something dug this, something big and powerful." Vance ignored me, marching deeper into the trap, but Russo saw it too. He unholstered his heavy wrench, his knuckles white. The atmosphere shifted. We weren't explorers anymore. We were intruders in a home we didn't understand. We walked for another 10 minutes. The tunnel began to slope downward sharply. The smell of rot grew stronger, becoming overpowering. It smelled like a slaughterhouse that had been left in the sun, mixed with the damp, earthy scent of a grave. It coated the back of my throat. "Jesus, what is that stench?" O'Malley gagged, pulling his shirt up over his nose. Our lights swept across the floor. Suddenly, the smooth dirt gave way to something crunchy. Snap. Crack. I looked down. The floor was littered with bones. Millions of them. A sea of white calcium. Deer, I said, kneeling to pick up a skull. It was yellow and brittle. Bear. Coyote. Things that live on the surface. Then I saw the boots. Half buried in the pile of animal bones was a tattered leather mining boot. The steel toe was crushed flat, as if stepped on by a hydraulic press. "Vance!" I yelled, holding up the boot. "Look at this! This is a human boot! From the 1970s, judging by the style! People have died down here!" Vance stopped. He stared at the boot, his face pale. Maybe an old accident. A collapse. "There's no collapse here, Vance," I said, standing up, dropping the boot. "This is a feeding ground. We are standing in a pantry." We turned to leave. The greed finally drained out of Vance's face, replaced with primal self-preservation. The reality of the bone pile had shattered his delusions of wealth. Okay, we go back. We seal it. We get the hell out of here." We turned around, aiming our lights back up the slope. That's when the light played tricks on us, or so I hoped. To our left, there was a large pillar of quartz and rock supporting the ceiling. As my light swept past it, I saw a shadow detach itself from the stone. It was tall, impossibly tall. It had been standing perfectly still, blending with the pale gray of the rock. When the light hit it, it didn't run. It just shifted, moving behind the pillar with a fluid, liquid motion that no human could replicate. It moved like oil pouring downhill. "Did you see that?" Russo whispered, raising his wrench, his voice cracking. "I saw movement," I confirmed, unsnapping the holster of my flare gun. "It was white," Russo said, his voice pitching up in panic. The silence returned, but it was heavier now. The whistle came again. Whoo! But this time, it didn't come from in front of us. It came from behind us. "Run," I ordered. "Don't sprint, just move fast. Back to the breach. Don't separate." We started moving up the slope, our boots crunching loudly on the bones. The sound seemed deafening in the quiet, announcing our position to everything in the dark. We were about 200 yards from the safety of our mine shaft. Suddenly, the lights on our helmets flickered. "What the hell?" O'Malley cried, tapping his helmet frantically. All four of our lights dimmed simultaneously, then surged brighter than before, turning the tunnel blindingly white, then died completely. We were plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. "My battery pack is dead!" Vance screamed. "It's drained! I just charged it!" "Mine too," I said, reaching for my belt. "It's an EMP or something. They can drain energy. They killed the lights." I grabbed a chemical glow stick from my pouch, cracked it, and shook it. A sickly green light illuminated our immediate circle, casting long, dancing shadows. "The cable," I said, looking at the safety line we had trailed behind us. It was severed. It wasn't snapped. The end of the wire lying on the ground was clean cut, sliced at an angle. They cut the line, I realized, terror cold in my veins. They're not just animals. They know what the wire is. They trapped us. They were waiting for us to get deep enough. The green glow of the chem light barely reached 10 feet. Beyond that, the darkness was a solid wall pressing in on us. "Keep moving," I hissed. "Stay in the circle of light, back to back. Don't look at the shadows." We formed a tight diamond formation. I took point with the flare gun. Russo watched the rear with his wrench. Then I saw the eyes. They didn't glow like a cat's eyes. They didn't reflect light. They absorbed it.
I saw two patches of void, darker than the surrounding dark, floating about 7 feet off the ground. 12 o'clock, I whispered. Something is standing there, just outside the light. I don't see it, whimpered Vance, clutching Russo's jacket. It's there. I can feel it watching me. The whistling started again, but now it was a chorus. Whoo! Click, click, click! Whoo! They were calling to each other, coordinating. We were surrounded by a language we couldn't understand, but the intent was clear. The attack happened so fast I barely registered it. There was no roar, no battle cry, just a sudden rush of displaced air and a wet slap sound. Help! It was O'Malley. He was on the right flank. I spun around with the glow stick. O'Malley was being lifted off the ground. Something had him by the neck. The creature was horrifying. It stood at least 8 feet tall, with limbs that were too long and too thin, covered in pale, translucent skin that showed the black veins underneath. It had no nose, just 2 slits, and a mouth filled with needle-like translucent teeth. It looked like a hairless, anorexic werewolf that had lived in the dark for 1,000,000 years. It was a pale crawler, but massive, a subterranean dogman. It stared right at me with milky, blind eyes as it squeezed O'Malley's throat. O'Malley kicked, his boots scraping the dirt, but the creature held him effortlessly with one hand. It sniffed him, tasting his fear. "Let him go!" I screamed, raising the flare gun. I pulled the trigger. Thump! Whoosh! The magnesium flare shot out, hitting the creature in the chest. It burst into a blinding red brilliance, sticking to the creature's wet skin. The monster shrieked, like metal tearing, and dropped O'Malley. It thrashed backward, clawing at the burning flare, retreating into the darkness, its skin sizzling. The red light illuminated the cavern for a brief second. I froze. The cavern wasn't empty. The walls were lined with them. Dozens of pale shapes crouching on the ledges, clinging to the stalactites like giant insects. They were all watching us, unblinking. "Run!" I screamed, hauling O'Malley to his feet. "Run for your lives!" We ran. The red flare died out, leaving us with only the fading green glow stick and the image of 100 monsters burned into our retinas. We ran blindly up the slope, tripping over bones, gasping for air. Behind us, the clicking sound turned into a thundering stampede of wet feet slapping against stone. They were coming. "They're gaining!" yelled Russo from behind. "I can hear them breathing!" I grabbed another glow stick, cracked it, and threw it behind us. In the brief flash of light, I saw them. They were running on all fours now, moving like spiders, their elbows jutting up high behind their backs. They were incredibly fast, scuttling over the uneven terrain without slowing down. "The breach! I see the breach!" yelled Vance, pointing ahead. "Go! Go!" I pushed Vance forward. We dove through the hole, tumbling onto the coal dust of Sector 4. "Block it!" I yelled. "Move the blast shield!" We scrambled to push the heavy steel plate in front of the hole. We slammed it into place just as a massive impact rocked it from the other side. Boom! The steel dented outward. They were trying to break through. "We need to get to the cage," I gasped, leaning against the steel plate as it shuddered under another blow. "This won't hold them. They'll peel it like tinfoil." We backed away, weapons raised. The tunnel of Sector 4 felt safe before, but now it felt like a trap. The main lights in the shaft were flickering. They were messing with the power grid again. We ran toward the elevator cage, about half a mile away. As we ran, I heard a sound that chilled my blood. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was coming from the ceiling. I looked up at the ventilation ducts bolted to the rock roof. There in the vents, I realized. The old mine connects to our ventilation system. They're not behind us anymore. They're above us. A vent grate 10 feet ahead of us exploded downward. A pale, clawed hand reached out, grasping blindly, fingers twitching. "Keep moving," I roared. "Don't look up. Just run." We reached the elevator shaft. The cage was there, waiting. "Get in," Vance screamed, hammering the call button, breaking the plastic cover. We piled into the metal box. I slammed the gate shut and hit the lever for the surface. The motor whined, and the cage jerked upward. "Thank God," Russo breathed, sliding down the wall.
We made it. We rose about 200 feet. Then the cage shuddered violently and stopped. The light died. "No," I whispered. "No, no, no!" We swung in the darkness, suspended 2,000 feet underground. The only sound was the creaking of metal and our own frantic breathing. Then we heard the sound of the cable above us snapping, strand by strand. Ping, ping. "They're cutting the cable," O'Malley whispered, clutching his bruised throat. "They're on the roof of the cage. They climbed down the shaft." We weren't escaping. We were just in a hanging lunchbox, waiting to be opened. "The emergency ladder," I said, pointing to the service hatch in the side of the shaft wall. The cage had stopped near a maintenance platform. "We have to jump for it. It's our only chance." I forced the cage door open. The maintenance ledge was 5 feet away. Between us and it was a black drop to the bottom of the world. "Jump," I ordered. Vance went first, terrified, leaping across the gap and scrambling onto the rusty grating. Russo followed, then O'Malley. I was last. As I braced to jump, the roof of the elevator cage dented inward. A massive white claw punched through the metal ceiling, slashing the air inches from my face. Debris rained down on me. The final cable snapped. I leaped. Behind me, the cage plummeted into the darkness, carrying the creature on the roof with it. We heard it crash into the bottom seconds later, a chaotic symphony of twisting metal. We were alive, but we were stranded on a rusty service ladder in the middle of the shaft, exposed and vulnerable. "We climb," I said, looking up the ladder that disappeared into the gloom. 2,000 feet. Start moving. Don't look down." We began the climb. My arms burned. The air was thin. The rust cut into my palms. About 500 feet up, we reached an old auxiliary tunnel. "Wait," I said, stopping. "Do you hear that?" Silence. Then tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from inside the walls of the shaft. "They dig," I remembered. "They dug those tunnels by hand. They're moving through the rock." A section of the rock wall next to the ladder crumbled. A pale, eyeless face pushed through the rock, inches from Russo's leg, snapping its jaws. Russo screamed as the creature grabbed his ankle. It didn't pull him off the ladder. It pulled him into the wall. The strength was impossible. Russo was dragged through a hole barely big enough for a child. I heard his bones breaking as he was forced through the rock, popping like dry wood. "Help me, Frank!" His scream was cut short as he disappeared into the rock face. "Don't stop!" I yelled at Vance and O'Malley. "Climb! He's gone!" We scrambled up, tears streaming down my face, mixed with sweat and coal dust. Russo was gone. We couldn't save him. The mountain was eating us alive, dragging us into its veins. We reached the 1,000-foot level. There was a pumping station here, a small room cut into the rock with heavy machinery. We scrambled inside and barred the door. We needed to rest. "We're dead," Vance sobbed. "We're all dead. They're everywhere." "Shut up," I said, checking my flare gun. I had one shell left. Suddenly, the heavy steel door bowed inward. Boom! Something massive was hitting it. "It's the big one," O'Malley whispered. "The one from the nest." The Alpha. The door hinges screamed. Metal tore. Through the gap, I saw it. It was bigger than the others, its skin scarred and thick, its teeth jagged and yellow.
It wasn't blind like the smaller ones. Its eyes burned with a red luminescence. It sniffed the air, then locked eyes with me. It smiled, a horrific, human-like smile that stretched too wide, showing too many teeth. "Back door!" I yelled, pointing to the ventilation access. "Go, now!" Vance scrambled into the vent. I pushed O'Malley in. "Go, Frank! I'm right behind you," I lied. I looked at the door. It was giving way. The Alpha roared, a sound that shook dust from the ceiling and vibrated in my teeth. If I went into the vent, it would just follow us. It would catch us in the narrow pipe. We'd be trapped like rats. Someone had to stop it here. I looked at the pumps. They were fueled by a large tank of diesel. I looked at my flare gun. 1 shell. "Sorry, boys," I whispered. I waited until the Alpha burst through the door, filling the room with its stench and its horror. It lunged for me, claws outstretched. I aimed the flare gun not at the monster, but at the diesel tank behind it. "Chew on this," I snarled. I pulled the trigger. The flare hit the tank. Kaboom! The explosion was massive. The shock wave threw me backward into the vent opening, just as the room turned into an inferno. The heat seared my boots. I crawled frantically up the angled pipe, the roar of the fire and the screams of the Alpha echoing behind me. The fire would consume the oxygen in the room, hopefully suffocating the beast or burying it under the collapsing ceiling. I crawled until my knees bled, the metal hot against my skin. I found Vance and O'Malley waiting at a junction, looking down the smoke billowing up the shaft. "You made it!" O'Malley breathed, his face streaked with soot. "Keep moving," I coughed, spitting black mucus. "We aren't out yet." It took us another hour to climb the service shafts. We finally emerged into the cool night air of the surface depot. I collapsed on the gravel, staring up at the moon. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The air tasted sweet. The mine sirens were wailing. The explosion had triggered the alarms. Safety crews were running toward us. "We need to tell them," O'Malley said, gasping. "We need to tell them what's down there, about Russo, about the nest." Vance stood up. He looked at us, his eyes cold. The fear was gone, replaced by the corporate mask. "Gas pocket. We hit a methane pocket. Russo died in the blast." "What?" I stood up, grabbing Vance by the collar. "You saw those things. They ate him." "Who will believe us, Frank?" he hissed. "If we tell the truth, they lock us in a padded room. We stick to the story, we survive, we get paid." Vance was right, in a way. The company debriefed us separately. I told them everything. They nodded, wrote it down, and then handed me a severance package that was more money I'd make in 10 lifetimes. Condition? Non-disclosure agreement. Official story? Seismic instability caused a collapse. Russo was a hero. They sealed Sector 4 with concrete the next day. They poured thousands of tons of cement down the shaft. I watched the trucks pouring it in, knowing it was just a Band-Aid. I took the money. I'm not proud of it, but I knew I couldn't fight them. I just wanted to forget the pale skin and the whistling. I left West Virginia. I moved to Florida, somewhere flat, somewhere with no basements. But I couldn't let it go. Before I left the site, I had stolen a look at the geological maps in Vance's office. I needed to see it in black and white. I needed to know why we were digging there. I found the map for Sector 4. It wasn't labeled Coal Seam. It was labeled Biological Containment Zone 4. Feeding Chute. The map was dated 30 years ago. The twist hit me like a sledgehammer. The company didn't accidentally find the creatures. They knew they were there. They weren't mining coal. They were mining them. Or maybe they were feeding them. We weren't miners. We were the meal delivery service. Russo was just the appetizer. I live by the ocean now. I try to drown out the memories with the sound of the waves. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right through the screen door, I hear it. Whee! It chills my blood and paralyzes me in my bed. I know they sealed the mine. I know they poured the concrete. But I also remember the way those things dug through solid rock. I remember the claws. Concrete won't stop them. It will only slow them down. And I remember the map. Zone 4. That implies there are zones 1, 2, and 3. They are still down there. And they are hungry. And every time I turn on a light, I check the shadows, because I know that eventually they will dig their way up, and they know my scent.